Hello folks, J. Scott Phillips here. Welcome back to my channel. And today we are bound once again for the early days of the golden age of science fiction. We're going to take a look at the story and artwork for Isaac Asimov's fourth ever published short story, Half-Breed, which was first appearing in the February 1940 issue of Astonishing Stories. Now, quite a while ago, I did a video about Asimov's debut in the science fiction magazines back in 1939. His first two short stories appeared in Amazing Stories early that year. And then during the summer, he reached his ultimate goal of finally getting a story published in John W. Campbell, Jr.'s magazine, Astounding Science Fiction. And that was the July 1939 issue, which just also happened to have the cover story of Black Destroyer by A.E. Van Vogt. And that is now kind of retroactively considered to be the story and the magazine, that particular issue, that launched the golden age of science fiction. So I'll leave a link to that video down below. This is now kind of this video here of Asimov's fourth story picks up where that one left off. So we'll pick it up from there. But first, let's catch up with Isaac Asimov from the last time we saw him, a mere lad of just 19 years old. It was March of 1939, and Asimov was feeling pretty good about himself. He just had his first two stories published in Amazing and was now just waiting for late June when his third story would appear in Astounding. That's when it would hit the newsstands. And so in the meantime, he was pretty proud of himself and thought he had a good idea for a new story. So he started working on that. He was calling it Pilgrimage, and it was going to be his first attempt at an epic story on a galactic scale. So he's putting a lot of time and effort into it and TLC, and he was excited to submit it to Campbell. And when he did so, Campbell rejected it. Now, Asimov was disappointed, of course, but he trusted Campbell, and so he asked Campbell where did he think that the story was falling short? Were there any suggestions that Campbell could make that maybe Asimov could rework it and resubmit it? Campbell had helped Asimov along these same lines with Trends, the first story that Campbell bought from him, and turned it into a story that they were both much happier with. So Asimov was asking for this favor again, and Campbell thought that was a fair request, so gave him some ideas and some recommendations, and Asimov took the story back home, spent another month or so rewriting it, and took it back in and resubmitted it to Campbell, and Campbell rejected it. But he did see that it was better in some regards, and so had some further ideas, something to add into the story that might give it a lift. And so Asimov was happy to comply with that, took it back home and rewrote good chunks of it, happy to take it back in and resubmit it to Campbell, and Campbell rejected it. So this story was kind of a three strikes and you're out kind of a thing, almost, but Campbell said, look, I know you've been putting a lot of time and effort into this story, set it aside for a while, for several months, 5 or 6 months. Just set it aside, don't think about it. Then come back to it with fresh eyes, and maybe things will start to fall back into place for Pilgrimage here. And so Asimov thought, okay, well, at least it's not completely dead. It's still got some hope. I'll have to set it aside. He wanted to keep working on it. He was passionate about it, but he's going to take Campbell's advice and do that. Now, in the meantime, a few months have gone by since his first two stories had been published, and he had a lot of other stories circulating amongst other magazines and publishers that kept coming back. They kept getting rejected too, and so now he was not feeling so good about himself anymore. He wasn't getting anywhere. The momentum he thought he had was kind of not coming through. But in the meantime, some of his correspondence with other publishers had been with Charles D. Hornig. He was the editor of Science Fiction magazine at the time, and Hornig told Asimov that he was going to be attending a meeting of the Queen's Science Fiction League in May. And if Asimov happened to be there, if they were both there at the same time, maybe they could meet up. And so Asimov made sure to be there, and they did meet up. And Asimov had 2 stories for Hornig's consideration. So he handed those off to Hornig, met him, and then went on to talk to other attendees at the meeting, and he had a great time there. He met, at that same meeting, he met Eric Frank Russell, Otto Binder, and Jack Williamson, three writers that Asimov was enjoying their stories in the pulps in those days. And the thing that was really exciting for Asimov was that for the first time at one of these science fiction gatherings of fans and authors, he was being accepted as a fellow author. And that just made him feel great. He was stepping up in the world. He hadn't gotten anything accepted for a while here, but he was a published author amongst other published authors there. And he just submitted 2 stories to Hornig, who he felt he was getting along well with, and maybe we can get some of this back on track again. Unfortunately, a couple of days after the meeting, the 2 stories that he had given to Hornig came back rejected again. And now Asimov was getting more desperate. He had some other things going on in his life aside from the writing here, mostly to do with college and moving on with his education, some other setbacks and things like that. He needed the money for college, and he wasn't making sales, so he was getting desperate. Now, his good buddy at this time, Frederick Pohl, had been bugging Asimov for quite a while to become his agent. Asimov had always balked at this, but he was desperate now, and Pohl had impressed him, as long as he had known him, with his knowledge of what editors were buying and what they weren't buying and why. And Asimov had seen this demonstrated between Pohl and his own work, so he trusted Pohl, so he decided to make a deal with him. He would give Pohl the manuscripts that he hadn't been able to sell himself, and he could take them and peddle them to anybody but Campbell. Campbell was off limits. Asimov wanted to deal with Campbell directly himself, as he always had. Anything else was fair game. And also, Pohl was not allowed to make any revisions to the stories, and there would be no 60-40 split. All right, that should be enough catching up since the last video and bring us up to date here for the story at hand. And it is now June of 1939. Still no new sales since March, but Asimov has now written 2 more short stories. One he gives to Pohl to try to sell to other publishers and editors. And the second story, Half-Breed, the story we're here to talk about, he wants to submit that directly to Campbell himself. So he takes it in, submits it to Campbell, and you guessed it, Campbell rejects it. And so Asimov is saying, okay, well, now what's wrong with this one? And Campbell says, well, I have to be honest, the problem here is you've written a story about an alien race that is superior to humans. And our readers just aren't going to like that. They're not going to go for it. They won't buy it. So, sorry, I cannot accept this story. So Asimov, okay, takes it, hands it off again to Pohl, who tries to sell it elsewhere. It's rejected by Amazing Stories also, and so Asimov is thinking, well, maybe it is the story, but at the same time, he's starting to realize some things about Campbell that he kind of didn't want to admit to himself, but he's been dealing with Campbell for over a year now, and some things are starting to sink in. And he's coming to the conclusion here that maybe it isn't the readers that don't like the idea of an alien race being superior to humans. It's Campbell that doesn't like the idea. And Asimov doesn't like to think this, but maybe Campbell has some prejudices that this science fiction metaphor that he's written about, one alien race, some half-breeds being superior to humans, is just a little too close to the bone for Campbell, and so he's censoring stories for his own magazine and rejects them on personal levels rather than on what maybe the readers would want to buy. Not long after this, Robert Heinlein will come to the same conclusion about Campbell, and then readers will see this more and more over the coming years. That's another story. Let's get back to Half-Breed here. But well, actually, in the meantime, now by September 1st, still no new sales, And he's written, by now he's written 17 stories and sold only 4. He's only had 3 published, and the 4th one, which was accepted back in February by Future Fiction magazine, they had accepted Ring Around the Sun, but so far Asimov had not been paid for it by September here, and had no idea when it was going to be published, if ever. So he couldn't really count that one. And with no sales after 6 months, his good pal Frederick Pohl dropped him. Not going to represent him anymore. Just kind of chasing shadows there, he figured. Although Pohl really liked his stories and always said that Asimov had the best rejected stories that he'd ever read. But unfortunately, he drops Asimov. That was on September 1st. But on September 2nd, though, Asimov heard from Charles Hornig from Science Fiction magazine that he had accepted one of Asimov's stories, Magnificent Possession. Now, unfortunately, this was Asimov's least favorite story. He thinks this is the worst story he'd written yet. But a sale was a sale, but he didn't know when this was going to be published either, some months down the line. But a sale was a sale, so he was happy that maybe something is starting to turn around here. 2 more months go by, and then in late October, October 27th, I think, his buddy Fred Pohl shows up at his doorstep one night and asks how much Asimov would take for his story Half-Breed. And Asimov is kind of taken aback a little bit here. He says, "What, are you still trying to sell that? Are you representing me again? What's going on?" And it turns out that that Frederik Pohl is going to become an editor of a science fiction pulp magazine, and he needs stories for his first issue. First issue, not it's a magazine not titled yet, but it's going to be coming out in a couple of months, and he wants to buy Half-Breed, and will pay Asimov $45 for it. That was half a cent a word. And Asimov thought, well, this is great. If Pohl is going to be editing a new magazine, this could be a new market for me then, maybe, and I've got a kind of a foot in the door. And as it turns out, Pohl is going to be the editor of 2 magazines, 2 bi-monthly magazines. One turns out to be Astonishing Stories, and the second one is Super Science Stories. And they're both bi-monthly, so they're going to alternate. 1 month, Astonishing comes out. The next month, Super Science comes out, back and forth like that. So in effect, it's really 1 monthly magazine, just under 2 titles, and may possibly become a new market for Asimov. And so in the premiere issue of Astonishing, February 1940 issue, Half-Breed is finally published. And for the first time, Asimov's 4th published story is mentioned on the cover. That had not happened up until now. It was not the cover story, but he is listed down below amongst some other authors. He's at the very last. He's the very bottom name on the cover, but at least he isn't relegated to "and others." Now, the story of Half-Breed itself is one of those stories that Asimov wrote as a young man, 19 years old, and he was still pretty wet behind the ears. And so the story itself reads a little awkwardly and naively in a lot of ways, but it still has some good ideas in it, I think, and it's still a fun read and has some engaging characters in it that you will like. But it is a story of an alien race that is superior to humans. Or in this case, not kind of technically an alien race, but really the half-breeds in question here are the offspring between humans and Martians. And the story doesn't really go into the Martians themselves, really. We don't know how humans and Martians came to meet each other. Was it on Earth? Was it on Mars? Was it somewhere else? We don't know. We don't really know anything about the full-blooded Martians at all, other than they must be similar enough in physiology to humans that we can interbreed with them. And none of that has really gone into. The point of the story is the offspring, the half-breeds, or as they're called in the story, tweenies, kind of a pejorative term, I guess, but they are the half-breeds, half human, half Martian. and they are relegated to, they're not, well, they're not even human. We don't know how the Martians are treated in this. It's all about the half-breeds here, and they are maybe servants at best, but they're really not allowed to mix with humanity on Earth here. They're relegated to homes or asylums, and they're just looked down upon by polite society. But it's also the story of Jefferson Scanlon. He's kind of an eccentric inventor type of character, and he's working on the secret of atomic power in his workshop at home. And he's just come up with the perfect equations, and he's been building an apparatus then based on the equations that can control and switch on atomic power. And he's convinced that his equations are all accurate, that he has built the machinery to exact specifications, and it must work. All the physics are correct, but it doesn't work somehow. And he can't figure this out, and at a point of frustration, he just storms out of his house and is going to cool down by going for a walk in the evening. And down the street, he encounters a gang of boys who are harassing and chasing somebody up the street towards him. And it turns out that this young man, 15 or 16 years old or something, is being harassed and heckled by this gang of kids here. He turns out to be a half-breed. And so Scanlon steps in on behalf of this half-breed, who his name turns out to be Max, chases the boys away and takes Max back into his home to kind of clean him up and look after him. Scanlon has a housekeeper, Beulah, who does not want this thing in their house. This is something, we don't want to have this in the house. It's not clean. It's this dirty thing. We shouldn't have such a thing around here at all. But Scanlon is now protective of the half-breed and takes him in and winds up, I guess, adopting him, looking after him now full-time. So Max moves into the house under Scanlon's supervision. And one day, Max is hanging out in the workshop, in Scanlon's workshop, and is kind of poring over Scanlon's notes, which have been sitting out, and notices an equation in there that, okay, this is interesting. He's got this thing in the configuration of a sphere, and yet the apparatus that's being built here is not spherical. Well, that seems incorrect. So he takes it on himself to start rebuilding the pieces of the machine into a spherical shape. Scanlon comes in and says, "Oh, hey, what are you doing?" And Max says, "Well, your notes here say this, but the machine isn't what the notes say." And this kind of confuses Scanlon. He goes, "Well, that may be right, but be careful with that." "Well, I guess you can't hurt it any more than you've already, whatever you've done already. Let's try it and see what happens." And they turn it on, and of course it works. And so Max has interfered and ultimately helped Scanlon solve the mystery of atomic power. And as a result of that, Scanlon becomes rich and famous, wants to give Max the credit for helping him solve this problem. And Max says, "No, I'm just a half-breed. Leave me out of this. You take all the credit. You get all the wealth and fame and credit for all of this, the scientific accolades, whatever it is. Leave me out of it." And this really troubles Scanlon. But without getting too much more into the story and what ultimately happens, I'll just say that Scanlon is so empathetic to the half-breeds that he takes steps to bring as many of the half-breeds out of the homes and asylums that he can, and he founds a place called Tweeny Town, somewhere in the Midwest, I guess, where the half-breeds can live and prosper and enter into business and commerce and trade and finance and all that in their own segregated little community, all off to themselves, and leave human society alone. One thing leads to another on down through the conclusion of the story, but it's a heartfelt story. I think Asimov is writing from the heart in this story. He's tripping over a few things, I think, but still, it's very engaging, and I enjoy the story quite a bit. Interesting that part of the story here, again, without giving too much away, is Scanlon realizes that Max is lonely, and so takes some steps to go to one of the asylums and find a female half-breed then to be a companion for Max, and then things that happen from that on down through some years here throughout the story. But interesting to note that at the time that Asimov was trying to write this little romance, he himself had never even been on a date at age 19. So he's tripping over a little bit of that. He at least relegates it not to the main character, but to someone else. So he doesn't have to get into his own personal experiences to fall back on in any way. But it's an interesting story to look at. So it's kind of why it's fun to look at Asimov's background leading into the story. And now if you read the story, I think you have a little more footing than if you were just to read a story from the Golden Age with no particular context. So with all that context having been given, let's go into the last portion of the story here and look at a couple of illustrations that were commissioned for the February 1940 issue of Astonishing Stories and Half-Breed. This is the first of two illustrations by Dan Eron for Half-Breed, and it shows a scene towards the end of the story where the half-breeds are packing for a spaceship to Venus. There is a sequel to this story called Half-Breeds on Venus. We'll talk about that someday probably. But right now, still talking about Half-Breed, we see on the left side here 3 half-breeds. One of these is probably Max, don't know which. One of them is probably his female companion, and another one we don't know. But there's a whole town of half-breeds by the end of the story here, and they are now having to leave Earth, and they're going to move to settle on Venus. But one of the things that we do know about the half-breeds and their physical appearances, they look mostly human, except for they have this very long, wiry hair that sticks straight up, about a foot tall, kind of like an Eraserhead hairstyle almost. And so Eron is showing us this in his drawing here. And so that's kind of an interesting distinction. And it's probably the only physical way you can tell them from humans, or we don't know if the Martians have hair like this or not, but the half-breeds certainly do. And so then in the background on the right side of the illustration there, we can see dozens of other half-breeds marching off to board the spaceship in the background there. Now, in most cases, a story as short as Half-Breed would only get one illustration, probably on its opening page, unless by some stroke of luck it got to be the cover illustration, the cover story. Not so much the case in Half-Breed here, but we do get a second illustration. This one is also by Eron, and it's the scene where Scanlon is throwing the switch after Max has reconfigured the apparatus into a sphere. And so we see the sphere lighting up, and looks like it's going to work. And we can see Max off to the side there in the lower right there, throwing his hands up in kind of a eureka moment, I guess. You could barely see that he's got that straight wiry hair sticking up over his head, but it's back in there if you look closely enough. Now, who is Dan Eron, the illustrator here? Eron is not a name that we really hear much of, and he was only known as Eron, not by his full name generally. I can find no biographical information about him at all, and maybe it was a pen name he was working under, but apparently, at least in the science fiction pulps, he was only active for maybe a little over a year, if that. And I thought I would just put up some examples of some of his other work so you can get an idea of his skill in those days. Now, this is only my guess, but I believe that Eron got his start also with Fred Pohl because his earliest work that I can find was in that very same February 1940 issue of Astonishing, same issue that Half-Breed first appeared. And he illustrated not only 2 illustrations for Half-Breed, but also for another story called Asteroid in that same issue, and that's the illustration on the far left here. Then he moved on, if we move down the line here, to Super Science Stories, and that was the second of the two magazines that Fred Pohl was editing. So Eron was coming in to work on Astonishing and Super Science Stories back and forth for quite a while, and until he also started to get work from Planet Stories, as we see down there on the third illustration. And then ultimately, he even made his way to Campbell's Astounding science fiction. There, as we see an example there on the very end. So he did quite a number of illustrations. I don't have a count, but I would say 20, 25 illustrations over the course of a little bit over a year, from late 1939 to early 1941. And then, at least under the name of Eron, he disappears from the genre. So there you have it, folks. A little background look at Isaac Asimov's fourth story ever published, Half-Breed, from Frederick Pohl's inaugural issue of Astonishing Stories, cover dated February 1940. It actually hit the newsstands in late December of 1939. But let me know in the comments down below if you're an Isaac Asimov fan yourself. And I'm assuming you must be if you've stuck with me this far through this particular video here. But let me know, have you read Half-Breed? And if so, what did you think of it? Maybe you've read the sequel story, Half-Breeds on Venus. Maybe we'll get to that short story for its own video one of these days, if you're good. Maybe you have another favorite Asimov short story, or maybe a favorite novel. Let me know. Let's chat about Asimov here for a little bit. Always fun to open up some conversations. But in the meantime, until we get a chance to chat again, thanks for watching.